Carl Linnaeus, often referred to as the father of modern taxonomy, was a physician and biologist during the 18th century. His fame and notoriety stem from his work that brought order of classification worldwide. Born in Rösholt, Sweden, Linnaeus from a very early age had a love of botany, and this passion and vision eventually manifested itself into his famous works, Systema Naturae, in 1735. By 1758 it had evolved into its 10th edition and considered the starting point for zoological nomenclature. My own experience as a literal example of this was when I was ringing out in Russia in 1999 and 2000. Here I was working alongside mainly Russian and German biologists, but many of the volunteers that went there are from all over Europe, so there needed to be consistency when collecting data. All birds ringed and recorded are entered into the daily log with their binomial name. With so many differing localized names from around the world, this system is the most precise, completely removes any risk of error or loss in translation. Okay, for those of you who are unfamiliar with this system, how it works, let me just go through one example and hopefully it will make sense. At the very top we have domain, and this is divided into three parts. Bacteria, archaea, basically another form of bacteria, and eukarya, everything else. Next we have kingdom, which constitutes Animalia, and then below this we have phylum, and this is represented by Chordata, the classification of vertebrates or animals with backbones. Under class, birds come under aves, which, if you think about it, aviation, aviary, avifauna, that's a great way to remember that. Now, next comes order, and the nightingale falls under pasiforms or perching birds, which make up nearly half of the world's birds. When it comes to family, this species belongs to Muscicapidae, or Old World flycatchers. And then next we come to genus, and this is referred to as Lucinia. And then under species we come to Megathynchus. Genus and species should always be written in italic, genus always capitalised. These combined are what is known as the binomial nomenclature. So for the common nightingale, it is Lucinia megathynchos. To bring this to mind and to remember a phrase, this is an easy way to do it. Dear Kate, please come over for great spaghetti. Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Unfortunately, I was unable to travel to Sweden to pay my respects, but I did make it to the Linnaean Society in London, the oldest biological society, and founded in 1788. I had an interesting morning looking at some of the artefacts housed here, though the biggest surprise was meeting Dr. Isabel Charmantier, head of collections and one of the co-authors of Virtuoso by Nature, and who actually studied under Professor Birkhead. Isabel gave me a copy of the book to look at, and of course little did I know then that I would soon have my own copy, and suggested that while I was in London I should visit the Royal Society, especially as they had a small exhibition on birds, and most importantly a copy of the 1676 copy of Ornithology. Just a short walk from the Linnaean Society, I entered the Royal Society and explained at the front desk that I was doing some research and would I be able to view the exhibition. The staff here were extremely friendly and signed me in with a visitor's pass, and I spent about 30 minutes taking in some of the exhibits and of course the book. The tercentenary stained glass window here shows the coat of arms, the Royal Society getting its royal charter from Charles II, and displays the motto Nullius in Verba, take nobody's word for it. Okay, sticking with London for a moment, let's just take in the bird life at St James's Park. Here there is an assorted collection of rare breed wildfowl, but one of the favourite birds with the general public are these fantastic ring-necked parakeets. However, it was the pelicans that I'd come to see, and in my mind I imagined them floating gracefully over the lake, but by the time I caught up with them they were grubbing around and vandalising one of the small gardens. Pelicans have been here since 1664, initially a present from the Russian ambassador to Charles II. Birdcage Walk that runs alongside St James's Park got its name after the menagerie and aviaries for exotic birds which were here in the reign of James I. Close to Westminster Bridge you'll find the Florence Nightingale Museum. When I was researching nightingales a few years ago, I accidentally stumbled across a story in which Florence Nightingale had rescued an owlet, a little owl, that was being tormented by some local children at the Acropolis in Athens. She named the owl Athena after the Greek goddess and would be her continual companion for many years, sitting on her shoulder or sitting in her pocket. One of the most iconic and historic buildings here in our capital is of course the Tower of London. At one time an imposing feature of the Thames River skyline before the concrete and glass soulless high-rises of our modern era. It is here that the ravens, loyal custodians of the tower, have stood guard for centuries, but as the prophecy foretells, should the ravens leave the Tower of London, it will crumble into dust, and great harm will befall the kingdom. Fortunately for us, these iconic corvids have the protection of the yeoman warders, faithful soldiers of king and country since the time of the Tudors. Only men who have served a minimum of 22 years with an exemplary record are admitted into the proud ranks of the yeoman warders, and a few years ago luckily we got to meet up with Chris Skyfe, regimental brother and at that time Raven Master at the Tower, a position he held for over 14 years. Equally as important and noteworthy is the Natural History Museum here in London. I think I must have visited this wonderful building over 10 times over the years, and I always find something new or revisit a familiar artefact like an old friend, seeing it again in new light. The Treasures Gallery, being one of my favourite rooms, displays such wonders as Hans Sloane's Nautilus shell, Darwin's pigeons, Archaeopteryx, Moonrock and the John James Audubon Birds of America. The day I visited the museum there was a John James Audubon exhibition on, showing off some of his incredible work. Here we can see roseate spoonbill, a bird I very much connect with, as I was fortunate enough to see this species in Texas at the breeding rookery at High Island on the Upper Texas coast. Smaller, though equally as important, is the Natural History Museum at Tring. Tring is a small market town in the county of Hertfordshire with some good pubs and shops and a wonderful 15th century church, St Peter and St Paul. The museum's lineage goes back to 1889 and its founder Walter Rothschild, but by 1937 it was given over to the nation and is now controlled by the Natural History Museum London. There is a fantastic selection of avian specimens here viewable to the general public, plus there are some magnificent collections within the archives, including Walter Rothschild's Unusual Birds, specimens collected by Charles Darwin during the voyage of HMS Beagle, and other collections of Alan Octavian Hume and Alfred Russel Wallace. During my second visit out to Tring, I took part in a behind-the-scenes tour, which was really something else. We got to see trogons collected by Alfred Russel Wallace, sheathbills from the Shackleton expedition, finches and eggs from Galapagos, some collected by Charles Darwin, and artwork by John and Elizabeth Gould. Here in the southeast of England, even if you don't know about Gilbert White, you've probably seen his name on the heritage sign on the A3, the main road from London to Portsmouth, and leads you to the village of Selborne. Of course, most naturalists do, and most birders should know about this great man. James Fisher referred to him as the first real bird watcher, Fisher being the leading authority on Gilbert White at the time, though that accolade stands firmly with Richard Mabey now. Unfortunately, there is no official portrait, but there are two known line drawings, one shown here with colour added. These drawings were sketched in White's copy of Homer's The Iliad, a gift from Alexander Pope to White, who translated this version of the Greek classic. However, I personally like this wonderful statue overlooking his gardens and the place that gave him so much joy. Known as the father of ecology and phenology, Gilbert White's contribution to natural history cannot be understated. Without doubt, he is most well known because of his book The Natural History and Antiquities of Selborne. This incredible piece of English literature has many accolades, being recognised and praised by such notable admirers as Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Wordsworth, Charles Darwin, who as a young man made the pilgrimage to Selborne, Virginia Woolf, Charlotte Bronte and Sir David Attenborough. At the Wakes, White's ancestral home and now a museum, there is an outstanding collection of his works from over the years. These include not only the original manuscript but works through the ages from different countries and even copies in Braille. I first read the book about 30 years ago and then again just recently, and I can honestly say his curiosity and observational skills are truly inspirational even today. It was also wonderful to read how many references White makes to Ray and Willoughby throughout the text. The Natural History of Selborne is the fourth most published book in the English language and has never been out of print since 1789. The book is unique in that it is made up of a collection of letters and a one-sided narrative cleverly weaved together and almost reads like a novel. These letters are correspondence from Gilbert White to Thomas Pennant and Daines Barrington, both contemporary naturalists as well as friends. Thomas Pennant was born and bred in North Wales, was an exceptional naturalist, traveller and author whose CV is extensive and impressive. At the age of 12 he was already reading the Ornithology of Francis Willoughby and hugely influenced by John Ray. One of his earlier publications impressed Carl Linnaeus so much he put him forward and was elected as a member of the Royal Swedish Society of Sciences. Daines Barrington was a lawyer and naturalist and most noted for his correspondence with Gilbert White and forwarding White a logbook journal in which he could record date, time, weather conditions, temperature, barometric pressure and other notes. Like White and Pennant, he was an Oxford man and served as vice president for the Royal Society. He was particularly interested in how young birds learn their song and considered a pioneer of phonology. I personally think that to really experience the world of Gilbert White, you have to visit Selborne. St Mary's Church is a great place to start, as not only is it the heart of the village, but is also steeped in his family history. Gilbert White was baptised here, curate here, his grandfather the vicar, and the resting place for them both. St Mary's Church dates back to Saxon times and has a mention in the Domesday Book, and as such there is much to see with many points of interest. I can't go over everything, but we'll mention a few. In the photo here you can make out a black memorial slab in the floor. This is the resting place of Gilbert White's grandfather, also called Gilbert and Vicar of Selborne. This memorial plaque to Thomas Bell I found particularly interesting and could have been easily overlooked, as not only was he Professor of Zoology at King's College, President of the Linnean Society and Vice President of the Royal Society, he also wrote a translation of the Natural History of Selborne whilst he was living at the Wakes. The story doesn't end here. Thomas Bell was the first president of the Ray Society, as in John Ray, who we met in part 1 of this episode, and chaired the famous meeting that looked at Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace's presentation of papers outlining their theory of evolution by natural selection. The top right is an image of Knights Templar coffin lid, and below is the coat of arms of Edward the Confessor, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, Selborne falling within his domain. There are 2 stained glass windows here that pay tribute to the Parson naturalist. This one is from 1920 and depicts Sir Francis of Assisi, patron saint of animals, and commemorates White's bicentenary of his birth. The 60 species of birds depicted here are all featured in the Natural History of Selborne. This second window, dated 1993, came 200 years after White's death, with the words emphasising how he was regarded within this wonderful community. For a faithful priest, humble student of nature, and a writer of genius. The 3 circular images showing his beloved flora and fauna. Gilbert White was a humble man, and his modesty is echoed in his wishes to have a plain and private burial without pallbearers or parade, but in the grounds of the church and in the village that meant so much to him. His headstone is simply marked GW 26th of June 1793. The grounds and land in which Gilbert White spent so much time have many areas where you can find a spot even on a busy day to reflect and really get a sense of what it must have felt like for him. I've now finally seen and heard swifts over Selborne, one of a few species, as we know, that Gilbert White was fascinated by. I'd just like to read a few lines out of Gilbert White's Natural History regarding the swift. The swift, like the sand martin, is very defective in architecture, making no crust or shell for its nest, but forming it of dry grasses and feathers very rudely and inartificially put together. Swifts, like sand martins, carry on the business of nidification quite in the dark in crannies of castles and towers and steeples, and upon the tops of walls of churches under the roof, and therefore cannot be so narrowly watched as those species that build more openly. But from what I could ever observe, they begin nesting about the middle of May, and I have remarked from eggs taken that they have sat hard by the 9th of June. In general, they haunt tall buildings, churches and steeples, and breed only in such. Yet in this village some pairs frequent the lowest and meanest of cottages, and educate their young under those thatched roofs. We remember but one instance where they breed out of buildings, and that is in the side of a deep chalk pit near the town of Odium in this county, where we have seen many pairs entering the crevices and skimming and squeaking round the precipices. As I have regarded these elusive birds with no small attention, if I should advance something new and peculiar with respect to them, and different from all other birds, I might perhaps be credited, especially as my assertion is the result of many years of exact observation. The fact that I would advance is that swifts tread or copulate on the wing, and I would wish any nice observer that is startled at the supposition to use his own eyes, and I think he will soon be convinced. Of course, as well as White's first observation about swifts, he was also the first to describe the harvest mouse, nocturnal bat and spritler willow wrens, now known as chiffchaff willow warbler and wood warbler, were collectively known as willow wrens, and again with White, with his eye and ear for detail, noted not only the difference in song but also structure, subtle plumage differences and habitat choice. As the above sign clearly says, Gilbert White's house also houses the Oates collection. Captain Oates, soldier, explorer and hero, was of course part of the Terra Nova expedition to the Antarctic led by Captain Scott, and sadly where they and some of their party perished. As part of this expedition, Edward Wilson, Henry Robertson Bowers and Apsley Cherry Garrard took part in the 5-week winter journey to Cape Crozier, the breeding grounds of the emperor penguin. It was their hope to collect eggs for continuing scientific study, but this venture turned into a nightmare and an exhausting ordeal that only yielded 3 eggs. The one above is at the Natural History Museum in London, and you can read about this in Cherry Garrard's book, The Worst Journey in the World. There is no better way to finish off a day at Gilbert White's house than a visit to the Selborne Arms for a nice warm fire in the winter, where you can write up your notes from your visit, or relishing a refreshing pint in the summer. So while we are sat comfortably by the fire, there is one final point in the Gilbert White story I'd like to make before we leave Selborne. During my research, I stumbled across a YouTube video that asked the question, was any animal, bird, plant or fish named after Gilbert White, and in particular was the white's thrush named after him? Now, I'm sure for many of you sitting out there, you already know the answer to this, but to be honest, in that moment I didn't. My brain did not connect a rare Asian Eastern Palearctic thrush with our 18th century parson naturalist. For me, white thrush is right up there with one of my most wanted birds, but I never even contemplated there might be a link. So I grabbed an old book off my bookshelf that I've had for many decades. In my 1858 copy of Richard Lashley's British Bird Eggs, there in black and white was the answer. This species is one of our rarities and was named after the Reverend G. White of Selborne, whose natural history of that place has delighted so many readers. Of course, this only led to more questions. Who named this rarity and when was the first British record? Well, after a little digging in historical rare birds, I found the answer to both. Thomas Eaton was a keen naturalist from Shropshire, a friend of Charles Darwin, and who built up a museum of natural history at his home, Eaton Hall. He also wrote a few books, one entitled History of Rarer British Birds. He was one of a few people who inspected a specimen shot in the UK and proposed its name. The bird in question was shot on the 24th of January 1828 at Heron Court, Hampshire, by Lord Malmesbury on his estate. This specimen was also inspected by Alfred Newton, who we will meet shortly, and William Yarrell. Referring to my Yarrell Volume 1, the following paragraph reads: By permission of the late Lord Malmesbury, I am enabled to give a figure from a male thrush shot by him at Heron Court near Christchurch, January the 24th, 1828, at first announced by Mr. Eaton, who, believing it to be a new species, conferred upon it, in honour of Gilbert White of Selborne, the names above cited, and his lordship allowed me the free use of this specimen for close examination and description. So, where is this specimen now? Luckily, I found this out fairly quickly, and after an email and a phone call, I arranged to go and see it. And as you'll notice in the following slide, the similarity between posture, between the print that we can see here and the actual specimen is remarkable, leading me to believe it may have been drawn from Lord Malmesbury's bird. Bournemouth Natural Science Society and Museum are usually open on a Tuesday, so I booked a day off work and headed down to Dorset. Here I met with Pam Field, the lady who I'd been corresponding with and who kindly brought the white thrush out of the cabinet for me to see. To be honest, you couldn't have met a more friendly group of people than the volunteers here, each extremely knowledgeable and enthusiastic about their particular field. As luck would have it, during my couple of visits I got to meet Keith Clements, the museum's zoologist, who with his wife Maureen kindly spent much of their day with me, showing me some of the collection, something that they have spent years diligently archiving and cataloguing. Charles Darwin needs little or no introduction, with his book on the origin of species literally changing how we see the world, and of course his journey upon the beagle and the discovery of evolution within the Galapagos finches, which is very well documented. However, I just wanted to point out a few places of significance to visit if and when you have time. Now, the Darwin family moved to Down House in 1842, 15 years before he completed and published On the Origin of Species, and I would consider this a must-see location. It is now run through English Heritage with lovely gardens to explore, a fantastic audio tour of the property narrated by David Attenborough, gift shop, cafe and a second-hand bookshop. It's quite a humbling experience standing in the room where The Origin was written, though unfortunately you're not allowed to take any photos. What was nice to learn, though, was that the Darwin family were very kind and looked after their staff extremely well. This they did by extending and renovating the Down house to make it more comfortable, and Charles Darwin would often ring for the butler, only to have a game of billiards with him. The day we visited, the weather was wonderful, and early migrants noted included chiffchaff, garden warbler and blackcap. The aromatic herbs stopped us in our tracks as we made our way around, and the flowers were fragrant and in full bloom. This must have felt like a real sanctuary to Darwin and an inspiring place for reflection and thought whilst putting the great book together. In the village of Down, just a 2-minute walk from the house, is the George and Dragon pub. It is here where Charles Darwin stayed before buying Down House, and the location where he gathered and paid his staff. We were told by the landlord that he often rode his horse through the village to the pub. Here we see the statue that is so well known to those of you who visit the Natural History Museum in London, positioned on the stairs between the ground floor and the first floor. To the right, a first edition German Origin of Species, and in the centre, Westminster Abbey, where Charles Darwin was laid to rest. This actually came as quite a shock to the villagers of Down, as right up to the last minute they had actually expected him to be buried in the graveyard at St Mary the Virgin. The wake and food all laid out at the George and Dragon pub. Alfred Newton, recipient of the Royal Medal of the Royal Society and Gold Medal of the Linnean Society, was a zoologist and ornithologist during the Victorian period. He became the Professor of Zoology and Comparative Anatomy at Cambridge, remaining in that position for over 40 years, and one of the founders of the British Ornithologists Union. He edited the BOU's journal, the Ibis, and released a wonderful 4-volume publication, The Dictionary of Birds. While attending Cambridge, Newton met with John Wally, with whom he had been previously corresponding, and this encounter then led to them becoming the best of friends. Wally was an avid naturalist and egg collector, which during the Victorian period at least was not that unusual. Oology, the study of bird eggs, was then, at least to some, an accepted discipline, as well as ornithology. Consequently, they both travelled abroad together, most notably being a trip to Iceland in hope of confirming that the great auk was still alive and holding on in some isolated areas. This expedition, however, was fruitless, as they encountered extremely bad weather, which prevented them from reaching these remote islands. They did, however, manage to interview the men involved in killing the last known birds on the island of Eldney in 1844. You can read about their discoveries in Gisli Paulsen's book, The Last of Its Kind, and hopefully more information will be shed about this incredible bird within the pages of Tim Birkhead's upcoming book, The Great Auk, which is due to be released in 2025. Only a year later, after their Icelandic trip, Wally sadly passed away, and this, as you can imagine, was devastating for Alfred Newton. However, he, like Ray, paid tribute to his friend and wrote up John Wally's oology notes and catalogued his egg collection within the pages of the 4-part set entitled Ithaca Walliana. John Wally and Alfred Newton, respectively, were an authority on both the history of the dodo that went extinct in 1681 and the great auk, something that was a elucidated to Newton was that even though he was a great advocate for Darwin's Origin of Species, he now had witnessed firsthand the extermination of a species through man's greed, ignorance and selfishness. This was not natural selection. With this in mind, there needed to be a change, and Alfred Newton knew it. Egg collecting was prolific back then, and the example I show here is of the harvesting of seabird eggs at Bempton Cliffs and Flamborough Head from 2 Victorian postcards on the northeast coast of Yorkshire. Eggs were not only collected for food but for collectors, many who headed to Bempton Cliffs from all over the UK to buy differently marked eggs. George Lupton being a notorious collector of guillemot eggs, shown in this slide. However, what really distressed Newton was the shooting of seabirds by roughies, men who went out on boats from Bridlington for the pure pleasure of killing seabirds off the cliffs for fun. And the figure quoted from many resources is that over 100,000 birds were being shot annually. Understandably, and after what he and Wally had witnessed and learnt from their trip to Iceland, he was deeply disturbed about the future of the birds and how they were being treated. In 1869, Alfred Newton seriously influenced the Seabirds Preservation Act, which started a conservation movement that is still in place today. Thanks to Newton's actions, the RSPB, started by Emily Williamson, the British Trust for Ornithology and the conservation movement as a whole, we all now get to reap the rewards of safely observing our wild birds that are afforded, along with their nests, the protection they need and most definitely deserve. During my visit to Cambridge to read Willoughby's Ornithology, I took the time out to go and visit and pay my respects to Alfred Newton. He is buried at Ascension Burial Grounds, just a 30-minute walk outside the main town. And as I read the words engraved on his memorial, a goldcrest, the smallest of our European birds, continually called from the trees above, and I'm sure Newton would have been happy to know he was in such great company. Though there are so many notable naturalists and or ornithologists I could highlight to bring this episode to its conclusion, the one I've chosen for me speaks volumes about a man who was truly connected to his local landscape and access of nature within it. Maybe not someone you might bring to mind when thinking about the great pioneers, but John Clare, the Northamptonshire peasant poet, was a great noticer and depicted the natural world through his poetry with an extremely intimate knowledge of its value. I first became captivated by the significance of poetry linked to birds a few years ago when I was investigating the history and biology of the nightingale. Though initially I was curious about this songbird's habitats and range within the Western Palearctic, my research led me down a very different road. Firstly, to the grave of Beatrice Harrison, the wonderful 19th century cellist who, duetting with a nightingale at Falls Riding in Surrey, is well documented. Beatrice was also a great ambassador in changing the caged bird laws prompted by her discovery that nightingales were being sold in markets after the deplorable act of having their eyes pricked with a needle to blind them in some perverse way to encourage them to sing. And to me this act is just beyond comprehension. It also sent me on a journey connecting with a 12th century verse called the Owl and the Nightingale. There are only two known copies of this Middle English transcript, one at the Jesus College, Oxford, and the other which I went to see at the British Library. The basic theme is that the owl and nightingale are bickering in a woodland, swapping insults, the owl calling the nightingale vain, and that she only sings in spring when lust is in the hearts of men, and that she, the owl, rids the great cathedrals of vermin. The nightingale responds that the owl is ugly and unclean. Her nocturnal activities equates with vice and hatred, and her only use is when she is dead and used as a scarecrow. Anyway, I ended up purchasing the book that translate the complete script. And some scholars believe it to be an allegory about Henry II and Thomas Becket, referring to the clash between the church and the monarchy and the murder of Becket at Canterbury Cathedral. Before you knew it, I was off on another tangent, visiting Berkeley Square of Vera Lynn fame, reading Oscar Wilde's The Nightingale and the Rose, Hans Christian Andersen's The Emperor and the Nightingale, then William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, John Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, and of course John Clare. In May of this year, we travelled up to John Clare's cottage in Helpston, Cambridgeshire, though in Clare's day this came under Northamptonshire. John Clare was born in this cottage, and though it looks extremely idyllic now, in his day this was a deprived area. He initially, like his father, was a farm labourer and thresher, backbreaking work and living and working under very difficult conditions. However, his knowledge of the surrounding parish and its flora and fauna was his playground, and he knew the fields and rivers, wildlife, and even the trees intimately. And this for Clare was his sanctuary and the backdrop canvas of what was to come. His love of poetry was sparked by being introduced to a book called The Seasons by James Thomson, a book that Gilbert White was also familiar with. Okay, so as this book was such an influence on John Clare, I've got a copy, and this particular edition is from 1842, and it's just got I'm just going to read a couple of lines out of it to give you a sense of what it would have meant to Clare, and of course this part includes quite a few different birds, so I thought it would be quite interesting to read. As rising from the vegetable world my theme ascends, with equal wing ascend my panting muse, and hark how loud the woods invite you forth in all your gayest trim. Lend me your song, ye nightingales. O pour the mazy running soul of melody into my varied verse, while I deduce from the first note the hollow cuckoo sings the symphony of spring, and touch a theme unknown to fame, the passion of the groves. When first the soul of love is sent abroad, warm through the vital air, and on the heart harmonious seizes, the gay troops begin in gallant thought to plume the painted wing, and try again the long forgotten strain, at first faint warbled. But no sooner grows the soft infusion prevalent and wide, than all alive at once their joy overflows in music unconfined. Up springs the lark, shrill-voiced and loud, the messenger of morn. Ere yet the shadows fly, he mounted sings amid the dawning clouds, and from their haunts calls up the tuneful nations. Every copse detangled, tree irregular, and bush bending with dewy moisture, o'er the heads of the coy choristers that lodge within, are prodigal of harmony, the thrush and woodlark, O'er the kind contending throng, superior herd, run through the sweetest length of notes. When listening, Philomela deigns to let them joy, and purposes in thought elate to make her night excel their day. The blackbird whistles from the thorny brake, the mellow bullfinch answers from the grove, nor are the linnets o'er the flowering furze poured out profusely, silent, joined to these innumerous songsters in the freshening shade of newly sprung leaves, their modulations mix mellifluous. The jay, the rook, the daw, and each harsh pipe, discordant heard alone, aid the full concert when the stock-dove breathes a melancholy murmur through the whole. Now, I'd just like to quickly go back to a part of this, of notes when listening, Philomela deigns to let them joy. So Philomela was it was the old binomial name of the nightingale. And in my William Yarrell's History of Birds, under nightingale, we can see, if I can get it to focus, Philomela lucinia used to be the old name of the nightingale. Now this name Philomela goes all the way back to Homer's Odyssey, and is also played out in length in Ovid's Metamorphoses. And it's the Greek mythology behind this is the story of Philomela. It's quite a tragic tale, and it's related, or part of it is actually relayed in T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. I'll just read a little part out of that. The change of Philomel by the barbarous king, so rudely forced, yet there the nightingale filled all the desert with inviolable voice, and still she cried, and still the word pursues, jug jug, to dirty ears. And that jug jug sort of sound is, if you've heard a nightingale sing, you'll really notice what that's referring to. The classics and the romantics often use Philomela in their verse, and it refers back to the Greek mythology. In brief, the beautiful Philomela is kidnapped, raped and imprisoned by her sister Procne's husband, King Tereus. To prevent Philomela from revealing what he has done, Tereus then cuts out her tongue. Imprisoned, isolated and unable to speak, Philomela weaves a tapestry, and in fact there is a tapestry at the V&A that you can go and see depicting this, depicting her suffering at Tereus's hands, and sends it to Procne. Procne, enraged, frees her sister. The sisters then take their revenge on Tereus, murdering his and Procne's own son and feeding the boy's body to the king. When the sisters reveal what they have done, Tereus charges them in fury. Before he can reach them, however, all three are transferred into birds. And again from Ted Hughes's translation, suddenly they were flying. One swerved on wings into the forest, the other, with blood still on her breast, flew up under the eaves of the palace, and Tereus, charging blind, in his delirium of grief and vengeance, no longer caring what happened, he too was suddenly flying. On his head and shoulders a crest of feathers, instead of a sword, a long curved beak, like warrior transfigured with battle frenzy, dashing into battle. So the gods turned King Tereus into a hoopoe, they turned Procne into a swallow, and Philomela into a nightingale. After reading this book, his world changed completely and for the better, well, at least for a while, drawing from his wisdom of the natural world, his incredible writing ability, a gift in fact, and his lifestyle and experience. He produced works that have gone down in poetic history and is now acknowledged as one of the greatest English poets of all time. These volumes include poems descriptive of a rural life and scenery, The Village Minstrel and Other Poems, The Shepherd's Calendar and The Rural Muse. John Clare knew his birds, and not just through some romantic notion of what they've symbolically represented in the past, but as an actual integral creature that was equally as important to the countryside as that ever-diminishing world was to them. I say that because he witnessed firsthand the destructive effect of the Enclosure Act, which diverted streams, felled woodlands and reduced habitat not only for the local people but for the wildlife as well. Clare was curious, patient and often a forensic observer of our countryside birds, not only of song, structure and plumage but their behaviour, their nests, eggs and individual personalities. So with that in mind, let's just take a quick look at a few lines from some of his poetry that highlight his innate knowledge of his local birds. Aye, here it is, stuck close beside the bank, beneath the bunch of grass that spindles rank. Its husk seeds tall and high, 'tis rudely planned of beech stubbles, and the withered fare that last year's harvest left upon the land, lined thinly with the horse's sable hair. 5 eggs pen scribbled o'er within their shells, resembling that writing scrawls which fancy reads, as nature's posy and pastoral spells. They are the yellowhammer's, and she dwells most poet-like where brooks and flowery weeds, as sweet as castellae to fancy seems, and that old molehill like as Parnus Hill, on which her partner haply sits and dreams o'er all her joys of song. So leave it still, a happy home of sunshine, flowers and streams. His description accurately highlights the markings on the yellowhammer egg, and as we can see here, with this clutch of 3 eggs taken in Dorset in the early part of the 20th century. Working left to right, these few lines are part of a verse called From Childhood. The daisy looks up in my face, as long ago it smiled. It knows no change but keeps its place, and takes me for a child. The chaffinch in the hedgerow thorn cries pink, pink, pink to hear my footsteps in the early morn, as though a boy was near. This cry pink, 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 or chink, 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 accurately describes a particular sound that the chaffinch makes. I'm sure many of you are very familiar and would have heard this call. The bumbarrel's nest. The odling bush, close sheltered hedge new splashed, of which spring's early liking makes a guest, first with a shade of green, though winter dashed. There, full as soon, bumbarrels make a nest of mossy grey with cobwebs closely tied, and warm and rich as feather bed within, with little hole on its contrary side. That pathway peepers may no knowledge win of what her little oval nest contains. 10 eggs, and often 12, with dusts of red, soft frittered, and full soon the little lanes screen the young crowd and hear the twittering song of the old birds who call them to be fed, while down the hedge they hang and hide along. Another great example of a long-tailed titnest. And finally a few lines from the amazing poem The Nightingale's Nest. And where those crimping fern leaves ramp among the hazel's under boughs, I've nestled down and watched her as she sung, and her renown hath made me marvel that so famed a bird should have no better dress than russet brown. Another perfect explanation of this wonderful songster's plumage, and of course, as most poets do, and always referring to this species as she, though as we know it is the male that sings. Sadly, Clare's life, at least during his latter years, were to recede into obscurity, seclusion and institution within the walls of a mental asylum in Northampton. Initially admitted into an open institute within Epping Forest, the place he escaped from, walking some 80 miles back to his home in Helpston, then finally to Northampton for the remaining 24 years of his life. Here he wrote one of his most famous poems, I Am. Though, as it may seem, his future seemed bright, with his notoriety and popularity being encouraged, his works published, supported by some in London and even the local Marquess. However, a series of events and his own mental health contributed to a breakdown that never fully recovered. On the one hand, yes, he was poor, but had a sense of community and place. He loved the village, the cottage, the birds and the landscape where he could ramble alone to be among the nurturing countryside and all its wonder. The dialect that the local people used was familiar. The folklore and fiddle songs around the campfires filled him with joy, but still he didn't quite fit in. So the adventures to London and acknowledgement of his talent must have felt uplifting and hopeful, right? You would think so, but this brought its own level of anxiety to his world. He didn't fit in here either. He now discovered pressure to produce with expectation. He worried about his appearance and his awkwardness, and as he was paraded as a sort of a curiosity for the onlookers to gawp at. Back in Helpston, he was occasionally observed by the London crowd who had come to the village to see the so-called peasant poet at work in the fields. You know, in fairness, many had helped and encouraged him too. And of course, the act of enclosure, and this more than anything changed him in a way. It destroyed his childhood memories. It denied him the familiar, the safety, the freedom of his precious land. Its effect on the local community cannot be understated. It simply changed everything. It changed him. Seemingly, and alcohol did not help, the final straw was when he was encouraged and helped to move from the village some 3 miles up the road, and the rest is history. John Clare is laid to rest at St Botolph's Church in Helpston, the very church where he was baptised, close to his ancestral home in the village that he loved, and surrounded by the countryside that had brought him so much joy and inspiration. He worried that his story and words would vanish and be forgotten. I hope he rests easy now, as his name and his poetry live on in perpetuity, and as the Northamptonshire peasant poet. And if you decide to visit this wonderful little village, and as we did, have a pint and raise a toast, know that even here you are in the presence of this incredible man, as here, at least for a while, he was a bottle boy saving his pennies for a journey into the unknown. Okay, well, I think it's time we brought this ornithological journey to a conclusion now. If you can remember that far back, we started off birding wisdom with a poem, The Seafarer, and I thought I would finish off with another poem, this time by John Clare. This is called The Fern Owl's Nest. I'm sure you'll figure out which bird I'm referring to when you hear this. The weary woodman, rocking home beneath his tightly banded faggot, wanders oft, while crossing over the furze crowded heath to hear the fern owl's cry that woos aloft. Encircling whirls, and often by his head whizzes as quick as a thought and ill at rest. As though the rustling ling with heavy tread he goes, nor heeds, he tramples near its nest. That underneath the furze or squatting thorn lies hidden on the ground, and teasing round that lonely spot she wakes her jarring noise to the unheeding waste till mottled morn fills the red east with daylight's coming sounds, and the heath's echoes mock the herding boys. Okay, well that's it. Hopefully in the next episode I'll be able to catch up with a few of the birds that I've managed to see in between all of this research and share that with you. But until then, I hope that you're having a good birding season, and I'll see you in the field.